Let me tell you about the Karathi Maximum Security Station, because if you're planning a life of crime across the galaxy, you should probably know which prison to avoid. Picture this, a massive metal fortress floating in the void around a dead star, looking like someone took a space station and decided it needed more spikes and significantly less hope. The locals called it the end of the line, which was either very dramatic or very accurate, depending on how you looked at it. Now, most prisons rely on things like guards, energy barriers, and the occasional robot with anger management issues. Not Karathi. Oh no, Commander Vex had a much better idea. Why pay for expensive security when you could just keep a massive reptilian nightmare as your guard dog? Meet Grimjaw, a creature that looked like someone crossed a T-Rex with a very angry crocodile and then gave it anger management issues. 12 feet of scaled muscle, teeth the size of dinner plates, and claws that could open a spaceship like a can opener. For 37 years, Grimjaw had been the station's pride and joy. Well, Vex's pride and joy anyway. The prisoners just called him their worst nightmare. And honestly, the system worked beautifully. Nobody escaped because nobody was stupid enough to try. Why bother planning an elaborate breakout when you knew that thing was prowling the corridors, just waiting for someone to give it an excuse to stretch its legs? Commander Vex, a purple-skinned Voltarian with enough medals on his chest to stop a bullet, loved giving tours to visiting officials. He'd stand there, puffing out his chest, explaining how his revolutionary security system had achieved a zero escape rate. What he didn't mention was that his security system spent most of its time being bored out of its massive skull. See, here's what nobody realized about Grimjaw. Sure, he looked like death incarnate, and yes, he could probably bench press a shuttlecraft, but after nearly 4 decades of the same routine, even apocalyptic monsters get a little tired of the daily grind. Wake up, patrol corridor through Z, terrify some prisoners, eat whatever slop they threw in his pen, sleep, repeat. It was enough to make anyone question their life choices, even if those choices had been made for them at the business end of a neural control collar. But routines, as any good smuggler will tell you, are just opportunities waiting for the right person to mess them up completely. The transport ship Nebula's Regret docked with all the ceremony of a funeral procession, which was probably appropriate since most of its passengers weren't expected to see sunlight again. Well, artificial sunlight. Natural sunlight was in pretty short supply around a dead star. Among the usual collection of murderers, thieves, and tax evaders shuffling off the transport was one human who seemed to have missed the memo about looking appropriately terrified. Jake Morrison, though everyone called him Lucky, which was either ironic or prophetic depending on how you measured luck. Average height, brown hair that looked like it had been styled by a wind tunnel, and the kind of grin that suggested he found the whole situation more amusing than concerning. The other prisoners, a colorful mix of species from across the galaxy, immediately took it upon themselves to educate the newcomer. There was Blorgoth, a 6-armed Zentorian who'd been embezzling from the Galactic Postal Service, and Creeks, a mantis-like hive queen who'd apparently been running an illegal honey operation. Charming bunch. Listen, human, Blorgoth whispered as they moved through processing, his voice carrying the kind of authority that kind of is from surviving 3 years in maximum security. You need to understand about the beast. It's not just big, it's smart. And it enjoys its work a little too much. Enjoys it? Jake raised an eyebrow. What's it do? Collect stamps. It collects screams, Cricks clicked ominously. Last prisoner who tried to escape, the beast played with him for 6 hours before finishing the job. They say you can still hear the echoes in Corridor K. Jake nodded thoughtfully. 6 hours? That does seem excessive. I mean, if you're going to eat someone, basic courtesy suggests you should get it over with quickly. Nobody likes their food to go cold. The other prisoners stared at him like he'd just volunteered to juggle live grenades. This was not the normal reaction to beast stories. As if summoned by their conversation, a sound echoed through the processing bay. The kind of sound that makes your intestines remember they're not permanently attached and your brain start updating your will. Heavy footsteps, each one hitting the metal floor like a judge's gavel, but accompanied by a low rumbling that might have been breathing or might have been the station's heating system having a nervous breakdown. Then Grimjaw appeared. If you've never seen 12 feet of apex predator casually stroll into a room like it owns the place, let me paint you a picture. Imagine every childhood monster story, add some very real physics, and give it the kind of presence that makes you question whether your life insurance is up to date. Scales that looked like they could deflect laser fire, muscles that suggested he could bench press a small moon, and eyes that had seen things that would make a horror novelist quit writing and take up children's poetry instead. The prisoners did what any reasonable beings would do. They found sudden interest in their shoes and tried to become one with the nearest wall. Jake, however, looked up at Grimjaw and said, "You know, for a maximum security facility, the customer service is really impressive. Do you also do birthday parties?" The silence that followed was the kind you usually only hear in space, which was fitting since they were technically in space. Even the air recycling systems seemed to hold their breath. Grimjaw's massive head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a sound it couldn't quite identify. In 37 years of prison duty, no one had ever responded to his appearance with what sounded suspiciously like a job inquiry. Cell Block 7, one of the guards, squeaked, apparently deciding that normal processing procedures should probably continue despite the universe clearly having a malfunction. As Jake was led away, still chatting amiably about the prison's architectural choices and whether the Dead Star provided good mood lighting, Grimjaw found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He was curious. Prison routines are sacred things. Ask anyone who spent time in one, and they'll tell you that the schedule isn't just about keeping order, it's about keeping sanity. Wake up at 06000, meal at 0630, recreational activities at 08000. If you could call staring at the wall recreational, another meal, more wall staring, sleep. Rinse and repeat until your sentence ends or the heat death of the universe, whichever comes first. Grimjaw's routine was even more rigid. Morning patrol at 0545, terrify any early risers, midday patrol to terrify the lunch crowd, evening patrol for the dinner shift, and late night rounds for the insomniacs. 37 years, no variations, no surprises. Until Jake Morrison decided that the universe needed more conversation. It started on day 3 of Jake's sentence. Grimjaw was conducting his morning patrol through Cell Block 7 when he heard something that made his stride falter for just a moment. "Morning, big guy. Sleep well? I have to say the acoustics in this place are incredible. I could hear you breathing 3 corridors away. Very intimidating, really professional work." Grimjaw stopped and turned toward Cell 7G, where the human was sitting on his bunk, looking for all the world like he was greeting an old friend rather than a creature that could turn him into human confetti without breaking a sweat. The proper response, according to 37 years of experience, was to growl menacingly and move on. Maybe bare some teeth if he was feeling creative. Instead, Grimjaw found himself pausing, just for a moment, as if waiting for Jake to continue. "You know, yeah," Jake went on, apparently taking the pause as encouragement. "I've been in a lot of prisons across the galaxy, and I have to say, this is the first one with a personal touch. Most places just use automated systems and guards who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. But you really seem to care about your work. It's refreshing." Grimjaw's massive head tilted again. Was the human mocking him? It didn't sound like mockery. It sounded like appreciation. Days passed, and the conversations continued. Jake seemed to have an endless supply of stories from his smuggling career, and he told them like Grimjaw was his captive audience rather than the other way around. "So there I was, trying to smuggle a shipment of Arcturian mood crystals past a Federation checkpoint, right? And the customs officer, this uptight Tellurian with a stick so far up his posterior it was practically a spine replacement, decides he wants to inspect every single crystal. Now, the thing about mood crystals is they reflect the emotional state of whoever's handling them. The first time Grimjaw made a sound that might have been laughter, it scared him more than it scared Jake. It was a low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder with a sense of humor. Jake just grinned and continued his story. The crystals started glowing this brilliant shade of embarrassed pink, which was when we all realized the customs officer had been thinking some very unprofessional thoughts about his supervisor. Who was standing right there? Who was his wife's sister? Family dinners got really awkward after that. Other prisoners started noticing the change. Instead of pure terror, Grimjaw's daily patrols began to feel more like, well, like a large, dangerous creature going about his rounds while occasionally stopping to listen to entertainment. The beast was still terrifying, still capable of ending anyone who stepped out of line, but there was something different in his posture. Something that suggested he might actually be enjoying himself. It was during the third week that Jake asked the question that changed everything. So what's your story anyway? I mean, before all this. You didn't just hatch from an egg already knowing how to terrorize prisoners, right? For a long moment, Grimjaw just stared at the human. Nobody had ever asked him about his past. He was the beast, the weapon, the thing that made the prison work. His history wasn't relevant to anyone. But Jake was waiting, with that same patient expression he wore when telling his stories, like he genuinely wanted to know. I wasn't always here, Grimjaw said finally, his voice a deep rumble that made the cell walls vibrate slightly. I had a name once, a family, a home. Jake nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world, a 12-foot monster having a casual conversation about his childhood. What happened? Federation expansion. My planet was in the way of a new trade route. They relocated us to a reservation, then decided we were too dangerous for civilian areas. I ended up here. That sucks, Jake said with genuine sympathy. So you're not really a guard, you're a prisoner with a job. Grimjaw had never thought of it that way, but the human was right. The neural control collar around his neck might give him more freedom than the others, but at the end of the day, he was just another being locked away from his home, forced to serve the Federation's interests. For the first time in 37 years, Grimjaw began to wonder what freedom might feel like. Jake Morrison had been in Karathi maximum security for exactly 6 weeks when he decided it was time to reveal why he'd really wanted to be arrested. It wasn't the recreational wall staring, though that had been surprisingly meditative. It wasn't the gourmet prison food which tasted like someone had confused nutritional requirements with a dare. And it certainly wasn't the charming company, though he had to admit he'd grown fond of his daily chats with a 12-foot reptilian killing machine. Grimjaw, Jake said during one of their evening conversations, I need to tell you something. I'm not really here because I got caught. The massive creature settled into his usual position outside Jake's cell, which had become as much a part of the prison routine as the terrible breakfast slop. Explain. I'm here on a job. Someone hired me to break a specific prisoner out of this place. Jake leaned against the cell bars, his voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing a really good secret. Professor Quirk, cell block 12. Ring any bells? Grimjaw's expression shifted to what might have been recognition on a smaller, less terrifying face. The terraformer. Sentenced for unauthorized planet modification. That's the guy. Turns out his unauthorized modifications were actually humanitarian projects, turning dead rocks into livable worlds for refugees. The Federation didn't like the competition with their official colonization programs. And you think you can break him out of here? It wasn't a question. Grimjaw had seen dozens of escape attempts over the years, and they all ended the same way, with him dragging screaming prisoners back to their cells or worse. Oh, I know I can break him out, Jake grinned. The question is whether you want to come with us. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ever-present hum of the station's life support system seemed to quiet down, as if the entire prison was holding its breath. I have duties, Grimjaw said finally. You have chains, Jake corrected. Very fancy chains that let you walk around and terrorize people, but chains nonetheless. When's the last time you chose to do something, anything, just because you wanted to? Grimjaw considered this. The answer was disturbing. He couldn't remember the last time he'd made a real choice about anything. Wake up, patrol, eat, sleep. The neural control collar ensured compliance, but over the years he'd stopped noticing the difference between orders and habits. The prison's security systems. Jake continued, they're all designed to keep people in, not to stop someone from turning them inside out. I've been studying the patterns for weeks. Guard rotations, system cycles, maintenance schedules. Plus I may have friends on the outside who owe me a few favors. Commander Vex will activate the emergency protocols. Commander Vex, Jake said with the kind of smile that suggested trouble was about to have trouble, is about to discover that his perfect security system has some very interesting vulnerabilities, especially when the chief security officer decides he's had enough of taking orders. That's when Commander Vex himself decided to make an appearance, his purple face flushed with suspicion and his medals jangling like an off-key wind chime. Beast, he snapped, apparently having never learned Grimjaw's actual name in 37 years of employment. Why are you spending so much time in this sector? Report to the command center immediately. Jake watched with interest as Grimjaw slowly turned to face his commander. The movement was deliberate, almost thoughtful, and Jake could see the exact moment when the beast made his decision. No, Grimjaw said simply. Vex's purple face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade that reminded Jake of spoiled fruit. What did you say? I said no. I'm having a conversation. When I'm finished, I'll return to my duties. You will obey, or I will activate your discipline protocols. Vex pulled out a small device that Jake recognized as a neural controller. The kind of thing that could cause anything from mild discomfort to complete neural shutdown, depending on the setting. Jake watched Grimjaw's reaction carefully. The beast's muscles tensed, his claws extended slightly, and his eyes fixed on the controller with the kind of focus usually reserved for prey. You know, Jake said conversationally, I've always wondered what would happen if someone, hypothetically speaking, were to jam the signal on one of those things. Just as a thought experiment, you understand. Vex spun toward Jake's cell. Prisoner Morrison, you will remain silent or face solitary confinement. Oh, I'm terrified, Jake deadpanned. Solitary confinement in a maximum security prison. However will I cope with the peace and quiet? That's when Grimjaw moved. Not toward Jake, not toward Vex, but toward the neural controller in the commander's hand. One massive claw flicked out, and the device shattered like it was made of glass instead of military-grade electronics. Vex stared at the remains of his controller, then up at Grimjaw's massive form looming over him, and made what was probably the smartest decision of his career. He ran. Well, Jake said into the sudden quiet, I guess that settles the question of whether you want to come with us. Grimjaw looked down at the scattered pieces of his neural controller, then at Jake, and for the first time in 37 years smiled. It was a terrifying expression on a creature with that many teeth, but Jake found it oddly reassuring. When do we leave? The thing about maximum security prisons is that they're designed around the assumption that everybody wants to stay inside. Oh sure, they have security measures to prevent escape attempts, but those measures are built on the foundation that the prisoners are the problem, not the guards. Certainly not the massive, terrifying creature that serves as the primary deterrent to bad behavior. When that assumption breaks down, things get interesting very quickly. Jake's plan went into motion at 03000 hours, during the night shift when security was at its lightest and most of the guards were either half asleep or playing cards in the break room. Phase 1 involved Grimjaw taking a leisurely stroll through the station's central command center and having what Jake called a frank discussion about job satisfaction with the duty officers. Gentlemen, Grimjaw announced as he strolled into the command center, his massive form filling the doorway completely. "I hereby tender my resignation." The 3 duty officers on the night shift looked up from their card game to find 12 feet of apex predator standing in their workspace, and their reactions were textbook examples of fight-or-flight response. Officer Clint, a young Regellian who'd only been on the job for 6 months, went with flight and managed to set a new station record for the 100-meter dash. Officers Vorn and Tasix chose fight, which meant they went for their weapons. This turned out to be a mistake. Grimjaw didn't hurt them, exactly. He just encouraged them to reconsider their career choices by systematically destroying every piece of equipment in the command center that might be used to prevent prisoners from leaving. Control panels crumpled under his claws like aluminum foil. Communication arrays became abstract art installations. The central security computer made a sound like electronic indigestion and then gave up entirely. Phase 2 was already underway in cell block 12, where Professor Quirk was enjoying what would be his last terrible prison breakfast when his cell door simply opened. "Professor Quirk, I presume?" Jake appeared in the doorway like a genie who'd been moonlighting as a smuggler. "Your chariot awaits." Professor Quirk was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent his life turning dead planets into gardens. Elderly, absent-minded, with wild hair that suggested he'd been conducting experiments with static electricity, and the kind of gentle smile that immediately made you want to help him cross streets and feed stray cats. "Oh my," he said, looking at his open cell door with the fascination of someone discovering a new species of butterfly. "Is this part of the rehabilitation program?" "Sure," Jake said. "We're rehabilitating you right out of here. Can you walk?" "Walk? Oh yes, I'm quite good at walking. I've been practicing for years." Meanwhile, in the command center, Commander Vex had arrived to find his night shift officers tied up with security cable and his primary security system sitting in his command chair like he owned the place. "Beast." Vex shrieked, his voice hitting octaves that probably violated several noise ordinances. "What have you done?" "My name," Grimjaw said with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow child, "is Grimjaw. And I've decided to explore new career opportunities." "You can't leave. You're bound by neural conditioning." "You're my security system." Grimjaw corrected, gesturing to the pile of electronic debris that used to be the command center. "Your security system." Past tense. "Also your environmental controls, your communication array, and your prison management database. I've been very thorough." That's when the alarm started going off, which was impressive considering that Grimjaw had just destroyed most of the systems capable of producing alarms. Apparently, the prison had backup systems for the backup systems, which suggested either excellent engineering or paranoia, so advanced it qualified as its own mental disorder. Phase 3 was the part Jake had been looking forward to the most. Throughout the station, cell doors began opening as the security lockdown protocols, deprived of their central control system, defaulted to their emergency evacuation settings, which was a polite way of saying that every dangerous criminal in Karathi maximum security was suddenly free to roam the corridors and express their feelings about their recent accommodations. "Attention all prisoners." Jake's voice echoed through the station's communication system, somehow managing to override even the destroyed equipment through what could only be described as smuggler magic. "This is your wake-up call. Exit interviews are now being conducted in the main docking bay. Departure shuttle service is available on a first-come, first-served basis. Thank you for choosing Karathi Maximum Security, and have a pleasant day." The chaos that followed was the kind that emergency response manuals try to prepare you for but never quite manage. Imagine a highly secure, carefully controlled environment suddenly becoming the galaxy's most dangerous free-for-all, and you'll have some idea of what Commander Vex was dealing with. Prisoners of every species poured through the corridors, not all of them interested in escape. Some just wanted to settle scores with guards who'd been less than professional during their stay. Others saw an opportunity to improve their accommodations by relocating to better cells. A few enterprising individuals started what appeared to be an impromptu marketplace in stolen guard equipment. Through it all, Grimjaw moved with the kind of purpose that comes from 37 years of knowing every corridor, every shortcut, and every hiding place in the entire station. But now, instead of hunting escaped prisoners, he was clearing a path for 3 particular escapees to reach the docking bay. "You know," Jake said as they jogged through a corridor while plasma bolts whizzed past their heads, "this is going much better than I expected." "Better?" Professor Quirk puffed, his elderly legs working harder than they had in years. "Young man, we're being shot at by prison guards." "Exactly. If this was going badly, we'd be dead by now. This is just aggressive career counseling." Grimjaw, bringing up the rear and occasionally discouraging pursuit with what could generously be called intimidation tactics, found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten: excitement. For the first time in decades, he was choosing his actions, deciding his fate, following his own path rather than someone else's orders. It felt like freedom. The docking bay of Karathi Maximum Security Station had never hosted a party quite like this one. Escaped prisoners were loading onto any ship that would take them. Guards were trying to restore order while simultaneously calling for backup that wouldn't arrive for another 6 hours, and in the middle of it all, a 12-foot reptilian former security guard was learning what it meant to choose his own destiny. Jake's ship, the Lucky Break, was exactly what you'd expect from a smuggler who'd named himself Lucky. It looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by someone with a very optimistic attitude about the laws of physics, but it had gotten him across half the galaxy without exploding, which was really all you could ask from any spacecraft. "Welcome aboard," Jake said as they climbed the boarding ramp with plasma bolts still singing past their ears, "and thank you for flying Air Morrison, where our safety record is almost as good as our reputation." Professor Quirk settled into the co-pilot's seat with the relief of someone who'd just discovered that his life sentence came with an early release option. "This is quite exciting," he said, watching the chaos in the docking bay through the viewports. "I haven't had this much adventure since I accidentally created a sentient thunderstorm on Kepler 442 billion. Grimjaw had to duck to fit through the ship's corridors, and the cargo hold was the only space where he could stand at his full height. But he didn't care. The walls of the ship weren't prison walls. They were the boundaries of a choice he'd made for himself. "So what's the plan?" Grimjaw asked as Jake ran through the pre-flight sequence with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested he'd made hasty departures before. "Well, first we get out of here before Commander Vex figures out how to activate the station's defensive systems. Then we deliver the good professor to his friends, collect our payment, and figure out what comes next." "And what comes next for me?" Jake paused in his pre-flight checks and turned to look at the massive creature who'd just thrown away 37 years of security for a chance at freedom. "That's up to you, big guy. You can go home if you want. Find your family, reconnect with your roots, all that heartwarming stuff. Or you can stick around. I could use a partner in this business, someone with your particular skill set. Equal shares, equal say in what jobs we take, and absolutely no neural control collars or orders from purple-faced bureaucrats." The Lucky Break lifted off just as the station's defensive systems came online, filling the space around them with enough firepower to level a small moon. Jake piloted through the barrage with the kind of cheerful recklessness that suggested he found mortal danger more entertaining than concerning. "You know," Professor Quirk observed as a missile exploded close enough to rattle their teeth, "I've spent the last 5 years in a maximum security prison. And this is still the most dangerous thing I've done all week." "Just wait until we hit hyperspace," Jake grinned, yanking the ship into a spiral that should have turned them all into paste but somehow didn't. The Lucky Break has some interesting ideas about what constitutes a stable trajectory. Back on Karathi Station, Commander Vex stood in the ruins of his command center, watching his perfect security record disappear into hyperspace along with his career prospects. 37 years of zero escapes, and now he had to explain to his superiors how his own security system had not only allowed a breakout but had actively participated in it. His comm system, one of the few pieces of equipment still functioning, crackled to life with an incoming message from Federation Command. "Commander Vex, this is Admiral Strex. We've received some disturbing reports about a security breach at your facility. Please explain." Vex looked around at the destroyed command center, the empty cells, and the complete absence of his primary security asset, and tried to think of a way to explain that his monster had made friends with a human and decided to change careers. "Sir," he said finally, "I'm going to need a very strong drink and a new job." Meanwhile, somewhere in hyperspace, Jake was discovering that his new partner had opinions about ship maintenance. "This engine sounds unhealthy," Grimjaw rumbled, his head tilted in the way that meant he was listening to something the humans couldn't hear. "Unhealthy how?" "Like it's trying to decide between exploding and giving up entirely." "Oh, that's normal," Jake said cheerfully. "The lucky break runs on optimism and stubbornness. Works great right up until it doesn't." Professor Quirk, who had been examining the ship's navigation systems with the fascination of someone discovering a new and improbable form of life, looked up from his console. "Mr. Morrison, according to these readings, this ship shouldn't be capable of faster-than-light travel." "Yeah, I know. She does it anyway. I think she just doesn't want to disappoint me." Grimjaw settled into the cargo hold, which had somehow become his designated space on the ship, and realized that for the first time in 37 years, he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. No routine, no orders, no predetermined path stretching out endlessly in front of him. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. So Jake called from the cockpit, "Anyone have preferences about our next destination? I'm thinking somewhere with good food, better weather, and absolutely no maximum security prisons." "Surprise me," Grimjaw replied, and meant it. The lucky break jumped to hyperspace, carrying 3 unlikely friends toward whatever adventure awaited them among the stars. Behind them, Karathi Maximum Security Station continued its orbit around a dead star, considerably emptier and significantly less secure than it had been that morning. And somewhere in the wreckage of the command center, Commander Vex was updating his resume and wondering if civilian security work paid better than galactic corrections. The beast had chosen to follow a human, not because he was forced to, not because he had to, but because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is decide to trust someone who treats you like a friend instead of a weapon. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of dangerous you need to be.